Hi everyone, Myra here, back with another edition of Storytime. We're ready to continue with the Dancing Cats of Applesap. We are starting on chapter 13. Get comfy. It was 3 o'clock when the cats set off up Dunn Street, dutifully following Miss Tooney and the candy bars. Melba, taking up the rear, was talking to herself. "Stay loose," she murmured through clenched teeth. She tried desperately to pretend she was Victor, but the jitters clutched her at her throat. "Look straight ahead. Don't think who is watching. Stay loose. Stay loose." She was carrying the big sign, "Cats March for Jig's Nose High." Only her eyes and the top of her head showed above it. Round the town breathed lazily and quietly, and suddenly they were turning the corner onto Main Street, very strangely. Then it seemed to Melba not like Applesap at all, for all the houses were hunched together, watching. A queer wind blew, and there was a menacing straightness to Main Street that Melba had never noticed before. Before her the street stretched out like a narrow bridge slung between mountain peaks. Far below lay a treacherous valley floor. One false step and Melba would plunge over the edge. One false step and... "Onward, cats!" screeched Miss Tooney from ahead. Melba jumped and pulled herself together. The line was approaching Applesap Center. By now small knots of people were stopping to watch, and behind Melba children on bicycles were catching up and keeping pace. They were laughing and calling. Melba held her sign higher and blushed, but with the sign in the way she couldn't see where she was going. "Hey you!" yelled a man's angry voice. "Get out of the road! You're blocking traffic!" A car horn roared in Melba's ear. She jumped back on the sidewalk. The cats were far ahead of her, and when she ran to catch up the bicycle riders, she was sure it was they and not the winds in her ears snickered. The marchers crossed School Street, then Center Street, then Melba's own Orchard Street, and here word of the parade seemed to have spread ahead, because suddenly swarms of spectators were lining the streets, pointing and laughing. If you hear that noise in the background, that's my cat playing with the paper. Melba was clinging to her sign as if it were a sinking life preserver when... "Isn't that Melba Morris?" asked someone close by. "What does she think she's doing hiding behind that silly sign?" Melba spun around in surprise. Irma Herring stood at the edge of her front yard amidst a group of girls giggling. She was wearing a pale pink church dress and a pale pink ribbon in her hair. But self-conscious Melba, half blinded by sunlight and teetering again on the brink of that bridge, saw another color, yellow. Immediately it seemed that she was back in her dream, that cat belly. Yellow Irma, and that the shooting must begin at any moment. Under Melba's feet the flat sidewalk trembled and fell away. Melba screamed. This time it came out loud and clear. She dropped her sign and tripped over it. Then she too fell and landed abruptly, scraping both knees hard on the pavement. Irma doubled up with laughter. "Why, Melba Morris," she squealed with delight, "you're even funnier than these cats. I've never before seen so many dumb-looking animals all in one place." Maybe if Irma hadn't brought the cats into it, Melba would have gotten up and run away back to her room crying. Under the legs of her pants her knees were bleeding. As it turned out, though, Irma started crying herself exactly 10 seconds after Melba hit the ground. Dumb-looking animals! The word streaked through Melba like a shotgun blast. They blew the dream away in the bridge, and a second later they changed Irma from a frightening, gun-toting tyrant into the very same person Melba had been pinching for months and months up in her room. Melba rose slowly and walked over to Irma. She raised her hand. Irma was still smirking. Then she grabbed Irma's nose and pinched it as hard as she could. Irma stopped smirking and screamed, "Let go!" "No," said Melba. "Help!" squeaked Irma, but no one helped. They stared. Irma pounded Melba with her fists. "These cats are smart," said Melba quietly, but holding on tight. "They're smarter than you are." "Okay, okay," shrieked Irma. She wrenched away and ran, sobbing, toward her house. Her friends hesitated, then followed her. "I'm telling my mother about this," yelled Irma between sobs. "You'll be sorry." "No, I won't," Melba called back. She dusted off her pants and turned to look triumphantly at all the people who, she thought, must have been watching. But no one was watching. All heads were turned in the opposite direction, down the street, where some sort of confusion seemed to have broken out. Shouts and a bustle of movement. The crowds gave a collective gasp. Then the cats hit. They came thundering back down Main Street like a single churning cyclone, tripping spectators and trampling Melba's sign to shreds. Children were toppled from their bicycles, dried leaves and dust spun through the air. "Mad cats, look out!" people were yelling. They ran for cover as the herd charged through. Then, shouting and pushing, they ran after the cats. Miss Toonie was in the middle, flailing her arms and howling. But no amount of howling or whistling, not even the candy bars which she waved in the air, could halt the cat's stampede. On they stormed toward Dunn Street, each cat nipping and hissing and scampering to be first. And on their tails came the frightened, hysterical crowds, and after them Melba, running flat out. Here's the picture of the chaos. Cats screaming and running, people screaming. Okay, chapter 14. Cats are fast runners, however. Excuse me, just now I get a drink. Cats are fast runners, however they are not usually long-distance runners. Few animals can sprint up a tree faster than a cat, but when it comes to covering whole blocks at a time, most cats run out of breath or lose interest. Miss Toonie's cats were 5 blocks from Jig's drugstore when they heard the guitar music float past faintly on a wisp of wind. The speed with which they ran those blocks would have set a world record if anyone had been clocking time. Of course, world records of one sort or another are broken every day, only they mostly go unnoticed. Melba, for instance, had just broken 2 records herself that morning. One by being the first person ever to pinch Irma Herring's snooty nose, and 2 by being the first shy 10-year-old girl to march down Main Street in a cat parade. But Melba wasn't thinking about world records that morning, and neither were the cats, who came racing down Jig's front walk, a solid 5 minutes ahead of the screaming crowd of spectators. There, without even pausing to catch their breaths, they joined Butch at Mr. Jig's feet and rose to dance. Butch turned his head to welcome his friends. From Mr. Jig's there was no greeting. He was crouched over his instrument, lost in his own wonderful music. Never, it seemed to him, had he played so beautifully. His fingers, long accustomed to picking out tunes in gloomy indoor corners, took on a new quickness in the sun. The clear air that floated his melodies also floated him out of himself and away. Not only was Mr. Jiggs unaware that the other cats had arrived, he did not hear the spectators, who began to straggle up shortly after, gasping for air. They surrounded him in a wide, suspicious circle and fell silent. First they stared at Mr. Jiggs. Then they stared at the cats, who were acting unlike any cats they had ever seen before. As Mr. Jiggs trilled, 100 mangy, beat-up felines swayed on their hind legs, lean and elegant and perfectly balanced. 100 cat faces turned back to the sky in pure pleasure. 100 cat tails curled and recurled rhythmically to the music, catching up and entwining each other, then weaving apart again. "Gracious alive, they're bewitched," gasped a woman. But they were not bewitched. Almost everyone could see that. The cats' dance was not weird or eerie. It was not a dark ritual left over from some unrecorded civilization. Neither did the cats appear hypnotized or crazed. They performed innocently and happily, like small children who, hearing the orchestra strike up at a party, dance out alone for the sheer pleasure of moving, unaware of how they may look, or of the grown-ups around them laughing and pointing. "How beautiful!" gasped Melba. She had arrived almost in tears at the crowd's outer rim. Now she watched in fascination. The spectators were murmuring also. Some could not keep their own feet still, and swayed to the music's throb. Then too soon the marvelous dance was over. Mr. Jiggs strummed a final chord. The cats came down daintily on all fours. The crowd shuffled and began to speak loud. Their voices brought Mr. Jiggs back to earth. Abruptly his head shot up and he looked around, blinking heavily. Then, before anyone could clap or race over to shake his hand, "What a tremendous performance," people were saying, he leapt to his feet. Mr. Jiggs dropped his guitar with a clatter on the ground. His face turned a deep purple and his eyes bulged like marbles. He opened his mouth and bellowed, "Get out!" He clutched at the door with one hand. "Get away, all of you!" Astonished and hurt, the crowd stumbled backward. "Go home!" shouted Mr. Jiggs, quivering with rage. He could have been yelling at threatening packs of dogs. "You have no right here spying on me. Get out of my yard. Get away from my cats." Here's a picture of them while they were dancing while he was playing. Okay. The frightened child cried. People turned to flee. Here was the craziness they had expected to see after the wild chase down Main Street. Now the charm of the cat's dance went out of their heads and was replaced by fear and anger. Melba realized the danger at once. "No!" she shouted, jumping to Mr. Jiggs' side. "No! No! Stay! This is a celebration! Free ice cream cones for all and—" "Get out!" roared Mr. Jiggs, cutting her off. "We are closed. Go away and don't come back." He picked up his guitar and stamped into the store. So the crowd went. Melba couldn't stop them. She tried, completely forgetting her shyness about speaking up. She pleaded and gestured and accosted everyone she knew by name, but nobody paid any attention, and Miss Tooney, who might have backed her up, was nowhere to be seen. One look at Mr. Jiggs, hunched over his wretched guitar, had been enough for her. One glance at the cats prancing eagerly at his spineless feet turned her heart to stone. Speechless with anger, she marched home, leaving Melba to face the furious throngs alone. "Melba, have you gone crazy? Do your parents know where you are?" barked a woman who was a friend of her mother. "I'm going right home to phone the Glowville Humane Society," a man growled. "This town is infested with cats." Even the children went, called away by their parents. They mounted their bicycles and slowly pedaled off, glancing back over their shoulders. When the people were gone, only Melba stood, stricken, on the front walk. Around her cringed the cats, now frightened and disoriented. "Poor things," whispered Melba, looking down at them. "It's all over for you now." She opened the store's front door to let them slink inside. Then Melba herself went home, and the route she chose was an out-of-the-way one, and gradually, as she walked, her shoulders sagged and her eyes fell shyly down to her feet. "It's a funny thing," said Victor that night, "but we didn't see a sign of that groundhog all day. He seems to have disappeared somewhere." Even this news couldn't cheer Melba, who crept away to her room, refusing to answer any of her parents' questions. "A cat march?" said Melba's astounded father. "Hush," said her mother. "Don't talk about it now." That is the end of chapter 14. Stay tuned next time, and we'll continue with chapter 15. Thanks for watching. Meow for now.